These are the aerial photos of Syria's Syria prison the United States is using as proof of its accusations.
Good morning.
The State Department says one of the military prison's buildings has been converted to something much more sinister.
Beginning in 2013, the Syrian regime modified a building within the Syria complex to support what we believe is a crematorium. Although the regime's many atrocities are well documented, we believe that the building of a crematorium is an effort to cover up the extent of mass murders taking place in Syria prison.
In a February report of witness interviews, Amnesty International said as many as 13,000 people had been hanged at the prison during a 4-year period between 2011 and 2015 for politically opposing the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad. In Geneva, UN-backed peace talks between the Syrian government and opposition are set to resume on Tuesday. Syrian opposition leader Nasser Hariri says the release of prisoners at the Syria prison is a top priority.
The time has come for the world, led by the U.S., to take serious actions to stop this human rights violation.
But back in Washington, when pressed by reporters about whether there would be a U.S. response to the alleged mass killings, the White House press secretary called on allies for support.
What was important about what the State Department did today was to really enumerate the atrocities and the human rights violations that have been committed, and then further ask the world community to join with us to put pressure on Syria.
The White House says it remains open to working with both Russia and Iran to resolve the Syrian conflict, but only if both Russia and Iran acknowledge the atrocities of the Syrian government and use their influence to stop it.
The faces of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's victims, political protesters who have vanished inside his prisons, and some that were tortured. These haunting images are from a powerful new film, Syria's Disappeared, The Case Against Assad, that just had its U.S. premiere at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. The film provides harrowing first-hand accounts from Syrian detainees and shocking photographs from a cache smuggled out of Syria by a former regime photographer codenamed Caesar. It comes at a crucial moment when there is a new international focus on Assad's conduct due to the recent chemical weapons attack and a renewed effort to bring senior Syrian officials to justice in international courts. We are here today with two women who made the film, director Sarah Afshar and producer Nicola Kutcher, as well as Stephen Rapp. He's the former U.S. ambassador for war crimes under President Obama and who is now leading the effort to hold Assad regime officials accountable in foreign courts. Welcome. Sarah, tell us how you came to make this film and why.
Well, I first saw the Caesar photographs in January 2014 when they first came out, and I was really shocked when I saw the photographs. Of course, I first thought, can these photographs even be real? You know, why would they take these photographs? And when I looked into it and I discovered that they were real, I thought that they would make a huge impact, you know, in terms of people talking about this evidence of mass atrocities. But it was at a time when ISIS had come to the fore in the conflict in Syria, and all the focus seemed to go onto ISIS, you know, and rightly so to some degree, because, you know, that was very significant. But months passed and I just felt that this issue wasn't getting enough attention, and so I started working on the film, and then later on I brought Nicola on and we investigated it together, you know, for a year and a half.
Nicola, if there is one message you want people to take from this film, what is it?
I think it's the fact that there are people in these detention facilities right now. There's tens of thousands of people missing in detention right now in Syria, in the regime facilities, and their families are in complete agony, going from place to place, trying to find out where their loved ones are, where they're being held, whether they're even dead or alive. And it's a massive humanitarian crisis on our watch. So I just think those people should be much more talked about. There should be an international awareness of that crisis. And certainly the victims who are suffering in these facilities right now and their families, you know, they deserve some action on this. They deserve the international community to try and do something.
Ambassador, you have met with Caesar, the regime photographer who took these photos. Tell us about who he is, why he took the photographs in the first place, and why he smuggled them out of Syria.
Well, he's rather an ordinary military policeman, and his job had been for years to take photos of accidents, to take photos of people who died in suspicious circumstances as part of investigations. But in 2011, at the military hospital where he was working, the bodies started arriving, 10, 20, 40, 60, 100 a day. And pretty soon he saw these were people that he knew. And they were young people, old people, people from all walks of life. And they'd been, many were emaciated from having been starved. All of them had horrible sores on their bodies. Many had chemical burns. Some had eyes gouged out and their limbs amputated. I mean, and all of them had an expression on their face like they died in agony. And his job was actually to take pictures, he and a team of 11 photographers, to take 5 pictures each of the bodies and put them in a file. So that permitted the regime legally to destroy the bodies, and then presumably to be saying they are investigating. But of course, there was no investigation. The file was a phony.
You've met with him, you've talked to him. He, at some point, decides to smuggle them out. Why does he do that?
Well, he goes home, he reaches out to members of extended family. He'd never been political, but to people he knew that potentially were involved in the demonstrations and involved in the opposition, and says, I got to get out. I can't do this job anymore. And they convince him that the best thing for him to do is to stay. And he stays for at least almost another 2 years. But to stay, and because he's the guy that each night has to upload them onto a desktop and then put them into the files, he has actually access to the records. And so to bring out, to take a thumb drive and put it in the computer, and every day or two, bring it out and bring it home. And one of his extended family members has an external hard drive, and they download this, and they save them and save them and save them, until finally, in August of 2013, he begins to think he's been found out. He's going to be training somebody else to take his job. And at that point, his family reports that he's been killed, and he manages to leave the country.
I'm still not clear on his motive.
His motive in this situation, obviously, was to create a record and to bring it out so people would have it, and that something would be done about it. I mean, I see him every 4 or 5 months in his place of exile where he and his family live. I mean, he's now quite isolated there in order to keep him safe, because his testimony would be very important to the presentation of what are a total of more than 50,000 photos, and 27,000 of them are highly relevant to this, that show 6,700 different individuals. Right. Tortured to death by the regime.
And I should point out that we are going to show some of these photos, but they are, I want to warn our viewers, they are extremely graphic. I first saw these photos a couple of years ago, and immediately they invoked images right out of the Nazi concentration camps. And I want to come back to something, Sarah, you said before, which is that they didn't get nearly the amount of international attention that you thought they would. Granted, ISIS was the big story at the time, but still, why haven't more people focused on these photographs?
I think that in kind of the way the current conflict is configured now, it's an inconvenient truth, because everybody sees it as a dichotomy, between Assad on the one side and ISIS on the other. And obviously, ISIS affects people in Europe particularly, and in the West, because, we have terrorist attacks in Europe, and, British fighters go and fight there. So it's all seen through what affects us. And I don't think people want to concentrate on what affects Syrians. And that affects Syrians, and it's still affecting them to this day. So I think it's partly that kind of focus on our own lives, rather than what's happening to Syrians inside Syria.
Some of the most gripping accounts in this film comes from a former detainee named Mazen Ahumada. Nicola, tell us about him and how he came to find himself in a Syrian prison.
So Mazen comes from a left-wing political family who have always been active in wanting free and fair elections, and they're a part of a Syrian pro-democracy party. So the moment the revolution kind of began and Mazen and his friends saw what was happening in Daraa when people had protested and the regime had clamped down very heavily on protesters, Mazen was going out and organising protests in his hometown of Deir ez-Zor. So he and his friends were, organising demonstrations, protesting, and the regime massively clamped down heavily on protest, any dissent in general. If you question the authority of the regime, they're coming for you. And they came for Mazen. So he was arrested and detained 3 times. The first 2 times were quite brief, but in our film we really focus on his 3rd arrest and detention.
And Sarah, what were they trying to get Mazen to confess to?
They were trying to get him to confess to having weapons. And, he very kind of clearly during that interrogation said, my only weapon was a camera. I was videoing, I was protesting. But, they want to get these false confessions from people who went out on peaceful protests. And, that's just one kind of episode that we show in the film of what happened to Mazen. There was a lot, he was in detention for 18 months. He went through a lot of torture. He saw people die in front of him. He saw people being tortured in front of him. There were youngsters in that detention facility. There were, 170 people, men, cramped into a small room, with no place to lie down, all, hunched up for that, period of time. Yes, I mean, he recounted a lot to us, and obviously we show some of it in the film.
You also do show a clip from the interview I did with President Assad in Damascus just in February, in which I confronted him with copies of the Caesar photos. I believe it's the first time anybody has ever done that. Let's watch that clip.
Who verified the pictures? Who they verified that they're not edited and photoshopped and so on? It's just propaganda, it's just fake news. They want to demonize the Syrian government. In every war you can have any individual crime. It happened all over the world, anywhere, but it's not a policy.
Nicola, fake news. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's so easy to say, isn't it? And we're in this, it's disinformation. It's just trying to throw you off. But as you said, you confronted him with a photograph, and we'd have loved to confront him with, Aham's photograph. In the film, we show the photograph of one person that's been identified in those photos. You hear the account of his mother. He's not photoshopped. He's a person that people know and love, who's shown up with numbers on his head, a number relating to a detention facility, which we know he was in, and a number relating to his prisoner number. And many families have identified their loved one in these photographs. So for him to say that they're made up and photoshopped, that's pretty extraordinary when there's so many families that have made identifications. And, and we know that their loved ones were disappeared by the regime, they were seen arrested, they land up in detention, and now they're in these photos. I mean, I can't imagine a conspiracy that could fake that amount of evidence.
And also, what I'd like to say to President Assad is, if there's nothing going on in these places, then why can't we go in there and see what's going on? Why can't we be let in? Why can't independent monitors be let in?
Well, he would say you are out to demonize the Syrian government.
If he has nothing to hide,
right.
If he has nothing to hide, why not let independent international monitors in, which the UN has been calling for since 2011?
Right. He was sat there in the presidential palace with you, and Hospital 601 is down the road less than a kilometre away, where the Caesar photographs were taken.
Yeah. Ambassador, you obviously have a very different take about the strength of the evidence against the Assad regime. We have a clip from the film in which you discuss that. Let's watch that.
For Stephen, the evidence against the Syrian regime for mass atrocity crimes is some of the strongest he has ever seen.
But you've got facilities that are part of the regime under the control of the president. So they can't say, oh, it's a bunch of crazy thugs that were doing it, and we were against that. We wanted people treated humanely, but sometimes boys will be boys, and I guess we just didn't know. Well, now they know, and they're not doing anything about it, not punishing a single soul. So you then have a case under international law of so-called command responsibility that makes commanders responsible if they know and they don't do anything. You don't even have to prove they gave an order. It's enough. So this makes this, the legal equivalent of a slam dunk.
A slam dunk, but in what court?
And that's the challenge. As I say, it's embarrassing that there's no court to take it to. I mean, the one thing that did happen after the Caesar photos came to light is the French, who felt very strongly about this, moved a resolution to refer the whole matter to the ICC. That came before the UN Security Council in May of 2014, just about 5 months after Caesar's photos came to light. And the vote was 13 yes out of the 15, but of course 2 no's, Russia and China, and it was a veto. And so that was blocked. Certainly the idea of trying anybody in Syria is impossible. I mean, this is what passes for justice in Syria, people being tortured to death by the thousand. And so that's not going to be the place. And so we look for courts where there could be jurisdiction. One, there can be perpetrators that show up in countries, and most countries have adopted laws that if somebody's committed a war crime or atrocity and they turn up on your territory, you have jurisdiction. There are not a lot of these perpetrators out there, but there are some. And then if someone has a connection to a foreign country, particularly if they're a citizen, and they've been affected by these crimes, that can give that court jurisdiction, just as if an American is kidnapped in some country and tortured and killed, and you find his perpetrator, you can try him in America because there's an American
So right
citizen.
now, where is the best prospect of bringing a case against the Assad regime?
Well, there is a case ongoing in Spain because a sister, very close to her brother, one of those in the Caesar photos, identified him, has petitioned as a victim, and under Spanish law, a victim in a forced disappearance includes family members because they suffer almost as much as the person themselves. I mean, the person may die in a few days, but they continue to live in doubt and think of all the horrors sometimes for years. So she's petitioned. The court has accepted that. In the case that I was part of the team that we put together, and it's featured in the film, we charge the people running that prison, but we also charge the people in the security services almost up to the top. In a national court, you can't prosecute somebody else's chief of state. Mm-hmm. You can prosecute his vice president, you can prosecute the head of the National Security Bureau. So that's happening there. In Germany, because they have so many of these victims and survivors and witnesses, they have universal jurisdiction and they can take any case that involves an atrocity provided there's a substantial impact on Germany. Mm-hmm. And the German prosecutor basically is making a determination that because Germany's been so affected by all the refugees that have come there, in fact, to escape these kind of atrocities, that they have a real interest. And so they're very close to beginning a case also against senior leadership. In both situations, each court could, if they hear that a suspect has turned up in another country, even a lower level suspect, they can reach out and extradite that person and bring them to trial. Otherwise, of course, there'll be arrest warrants out there and red notices with Interpol. People may not be arrested, but of course, even in the ICC, they sometimes, or in the Yugoslavia Tribunal, it took 18 years to bring in Mladic.
Sarah, you make a brief reference in the film to ISIS and its atrocities, but isn't it true that the barbarism of ISIS and the al-Nusra Front is a big factor in sustaining the Assad regime, that is, as fearful as people are, as Syrians are, of Assad, they don't want to live in a country run by radical jihadis?
But a big factor keeping President Assad in place at the moment is Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah. I mean, you can't ignore that. That is how he is in place there. Russia said they were joining the war in order to keep him there. Mm-hmm. Of course, people don't want ISIS, but they also don't, it's up to the Syrian people what they want for their future. But we're pointing out in the film these atrocities, which are incredibly barbaric and grisly, happened, and they happened in the facilities of President Assad. they are as barbaric as those atrocities, that ISIS carry out. Why should the choice for Syrians be between these two things? There are people, who went out on the streets asking for democratic reform, who want their country to be democratic, and they're getting squeezed out in this. And obviously many of them have left now, and they're refugees in Europe and elsewhere. So it's up to the Syrian people what they want for the future. In the film, we want people to bear witness to the atrocities that have happened, that the regime has committed.
And do keep in mind, 80 to 90, according to all the international experts, 80 to 90% of the crimes have been committed by the regime. And the regime has destroyed in community after community the middle, the moderates, the people that could be resilient against ISIS. When this whole thing started and people like Mazen and others and Aham were out demonstrating, there was no ISIS that they were facing.